It was early morning when the golden sunlight touched the runway, giving the private jet a royal glow. Derek Miles, the well-known black CEO of a fast-growing tech company, walked toward his jet with quiet confidence. He was tall, calm, and always dressed perfectly, the kind of man who made people listen before he even said a word. This flight was supposed to be just another business trip, one of many he took every month. His schedule was tight, but his mind was focused. The deal he was flying to close would take his company to the next level. Derek's team followed him closely, a group of loyal executives who admired and feared him at the same time. They joked softly as they rolled their suitcases across the runway. The mood was light and full of excitement. Everyone felt proud to be flying on the CEO's private jet. It wasn't just a symbol of luxury. It was proof that all their hard work was paying off. Inside the jet, everything looked perfect. Cream-colored leather seats, soft lighting, the smell of fresh coffee in the air. It was comfort in the sky. The flight attendant, Sarah Donovan, was already there, making sure everything looked just right. She had been working on private flights for years and was known for her strict attention to detail. Her uniform was spotless, her hair tied neatly, and her smile looked professional, though not very warm. As the team settled in, Sarah offered drinks with a polite tone. Derek thanked her with a nod and took his usual seat by the window. He liked looking out at the clouds, thinking about the big picture, both in the sky and in business. His assistant, James, sat across from him, checking emails on his tablet. The other team members chatted about the meeting ahead, half nervous, half excited. It was a normal flight, or so they thought. For a few minutes, everything felt calm and peaceful. The engines hummed softly and the cabin filled with low laughter and the clinking of coffee cups. Derek leaned back, loosened his tie, and closed his eyes for a moment. He had worked hard for this life, from growing up in a small neighborhood to becoming one of the youngest CEOs in his field. This jet wasn't just transportation. It was a symbol of how far he had come. Sarah, meanwhile, moved through the cabin with quiet precision. She refilled drinks, checked seatbelts, and made sure every detail was perfect. But inside, something about her seemed off. Her movements were slightly tense, her smile tight. Derek noticed it, though he didn't say anything. He believed in staying calm and letting people show who they were with time. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Sarah gave the usual safety instructions, her voice clear but cold. The team listened half-heartedly. They'd flown together so many times they could recite the instructions by heart. Derek, however, watched her carefully. He had a strong sense for people's moods. It was one of the reasons he was a great leader. Something about Sarah's tone made him uneasy. Once the jet began to move, Sarah secured the cabin and took her seat near the front. Through the window, the world outside started to blur. The engines roared and the jet lifted smoothly into the sky. The feeling of weightlessness filled the cabin, and for a brief moment everyone was quiet, watching the earth shrink below them. Derek smiled slightly. Flying always reminded him of freedom, of breaking limits. He thought about how far his company had come and how this deal would open new doors. He was already imagining the future, new offices, new investors, maybe even expanding overseas. His heart filled with pride. But even in this moment of peace, something subtle began to shift. Sarah stood up again, walking down the aisle with a stiff posture. Her expression looked harder now, almost as if she were forcing herself to stay composed. She adjusted a cup on the table, straightened a napkin that didn't need fixing, and checked the catering list again. Derek noticed her unusual focus, but assumed she was just trying to do her job perfectly. James, his assistant, asked Sarah for a small favor, to move the meeting folders from one seat to another so Derek could use the table for notes. It was a simple request, but Sarah paused for a second too long before agreeing. Her smile flickered. "Of course, sir," she said, and turned quickly to do it. Derek didn't think much of it. He simply nodded in thanks. But in that brief exchange, something in Sarah's eyes looked distant, almost resentful. The rest of the team didn't notice. They were busy laughing about something funny that had happened at the last conference. Derek joined in, though his mind was still half on Sarah. He believed in trusting his instincts, and something about her energy didn't sit right. Still, he pushed the thought aside. It was a long flight ahead and he had more important things to focus on. Outside, the clouds rolled past like white waves. Inside, laughter continued. the air rich with the scent of luxury and success. To anyone looking in, it was the perfect flight. A group of powerful executives, a calm CEO, and a professional flight attendant making sure everything ran smoothly. But underneath that calm surface, small sparks of tension were beginning to form, invisible to most, but strong enough to change everything that would happen next. No one on that jet could have guessed that in less than an hour, peace would turn into chaos, respect would turn into conflict, and a moment of pride would become a headline the world would talk about for weeks. For now, though, everything still looked perfect. The sky was clear, the jet was steady, and Derek Miles sat quietly, unaware that the calm before the takeoff was just the silence before the storm. The jet had been in the air for nearly an hour. At first, everything felt calm and quiet. Derek Miles was reading through the final version of a business proposal while sipping his coffee. His team was still in good spirits, talking softly, planning what to say at the upcoming investor meeting. The city below had disappeared, and all that could be seen from the window was a sea of endless clouds and bright sunlight. It was the kind of peaceful silence that made you forget the world below. But slowly the mood began to shift. Something small, almost invisible at first, started to change in the air. The laughter faded. The temperature felt a little colder. Sarah Donovan, the flight attendant, moved through the aisle with a calm face, but her body language told a different story. Her steps were sharp, her jaw tight. She kept checking the catering tray again and again, as if trying to control something she couldn't explain. Derek noticed. He didn't say anything at first. He preferred to observe before reacting. But when Sarah passed him the coffee pot for a refill, her hand trembled slightly. She avoided eye contact. Derek looked up and asked kindly, "Are you all right, Miss Donovan?" "I'm fine, sir," she said quickly, almost too quickly, then turned away before he could respond. Her voice had a strange mix of politeness and irritation. Derek watched her walk back to the galley, his instincts telling him that something wasn't fine at all. A few minutes later, James, Derek's assistant, politely asked Sarah if she could bring out the lunch a bit earlier than planned since the team had to prepare notes. It was a normal request, but Sarah froze for a moment. Then, without turning around, she said, "The schedule is already set, sir. Lunch will be served at the usual time." James blinked, surprised by her tone. "It's just 15 minutes early," he said, smiling. "We're trying to fit in some prep time." Sarah turned to face him, her eyes cold. "I said the schedule is set. I can't change it." The rest of the team went quiet. The atmosphere shifted immediately. An invisible line had been crossed. Derek looked up from his laptop, watching carefully. James raised his eyebrows, confused, and leaned back in his seat. It wasn't the request that mattered now. It was her attitude. Trying to keep the peace, Derek spoke softly.
"It's okay, James. Let's stick with her schedule."
"No need to rush," Sarah didn't respond. She simply nodded and disappeared behind the curtain, separating the galley from the cabin. But everyone could feel it now, the tension. It hung in the air like static before a storm. For the next half hour, the silence grew heavier. The laughter was gone. The team members whispered quietly, pretending to work. Derek kept typing on his laptop, but his eyes occasionally drifted to the front of the jet where Sarah stood, arms crossed, staring out of the small window. Something was wrong. Very wrong. When Sarah finally returned with the meals, she placed each tray down without her usual care. One tray slid slightly, almost spilling. Derek noticed again her hands were shaking. He caught the plate before it slipped and said calmly, "It's all right. No harm done." But instead of apologizing, Sarah looked at him sharply and said, "Maybe if your team didn't keep changing the plan, it wouldn't happen." The cabin froze. Derek's assistant opened his mouth to respond, but Derek held up a hand. "It's fine," he said again, voice even but firm. He didn't want to escalate it. Not yet. Sarah turned and walked away quickly, her shoulders stiff. The sound of the galley door closing echoed through the quiet cabin. Derek leaned back in his seat, trying to make sense of what just happened. He wasn't the kind of man to get angry easily. But this situation was different. Sarah wasn't just being unprofessional. It felt personal, like she had some kind of hidden anger or resentment boiling under the surface. James whispered, "What's her problem?" Derek shook his head. "I don't know. But keep calm. We're guests in her workspace right now." The team tried to move on, but it was impossible to ignore the strange tension. Every time Sarah passed through the aisle, no one spoke. Her footsteps seemed louder than before. Even the sound of the engines felt sharper, heavier. Then came the moment that truly changed everything. Derek politely asked Sarah if she could adjust the cabin lights because he wanted to review some documents. It was a simple, calm request. She turned slowly, her face blank but her eyes dark. "You want me to change the lights now?" she said flatly. "Yes," Derek replied, still polite. "Just a bit brighter, please." Sarah exhaled sharply, not quite a sigh but almost a sign of disbelief. Then, without saying another word, she reached for the control panel and pressed the wrong button, dimming the lights instead. The cabin went almost dark. James stood up. "Excuse me, but I know what I'm doing." Sarah snapped suddenly, her voice breaking the quiet like thunder. Everyone froze. Derek slowly stood up, not in anger, but to show calm authority. "Ms. Donovan," he said firmly, "please take a breath. No one here means you any disrespect." For a moment, her face softened. Then her expression turned hard again, almost as if she remembered something that reignited her anger. She turned away, muttering under her breath, "You wouldn't understand." Derek watched her disappear behind the curtain once more. He had no idea that this small clash, these tiny signs of anger, were only the beginning. Something deeper was going on, something that would explode in ways no one could imagine. Up in the sky, the jet kept cutting through the clouds, but inside, the air had changed completely. The peace that had filled the cabin earlier was gone. In its place was silence, tension, and the uneasy feeling that something terrible was about to happen, and soon it would. The plane had been in the air for almost 2 hours now. From the outside, it looked like the perfect flight, smooth, calm, steady. But inside, everything felt different. The quiet was heavy, uncomfortable, and full of tension. No one dared to speak loudly. Even the sound of typing or a paper turning felt too sharp in the stillness. Derek Miles sat in his seat, pretending to read his tablet, but his mind wasn't on the screen. He was thinking about Sarah. Something about her behavior didn't make sense. She was professional when they boarded, but ever since takeoff, her attitude had completely changed. It wasn't just stress, it was something deeper. Like she was carrying anger that had nothing to do with them. He had dealt with difficult people before. Angry investors, jealous competitors, even employees who tried to test his patience. But this felt different. This was personal, though he couldn't understand why. Behind the curtain, Sarah was standing in the small galley, gripping the counter so hard her knuckles turned white. Her breathing was fast and uneven. She could still hear their voices, especially Derek's calm tone, the one that sounded polite but powerful. It reminded her of every boss who ever spoke down to her, every man who made her feel invisible while smiling to her face. Her mind twisted reality. She wasn't seeing Derek as himself anymore. He had become a symbol of everyone she ever resented. When she finally stepped out again, her smile was gone. Her face looked calm, but her eyes were sharp, focused. Derek looked up, noticing the change instantly. He gave a polite nod and said, "Thank you, Ms. Donovan. Could I have a glass of water, please?" Sarah didn't move. For a few seconds, she just stood there, staring at him. The silence stretched too long, enough for everyone to notice. Then she said, "You can get it yourself." The words cut through the air like glass. James, Derek's assistant, blinked in shock. One of the team members whispered, "What did she just say?" Derek slowly stood up, not in anger, but in disbelief. "Excuse me?" he said softly, keeping his voice calm. "Did I hear that right?" Sarah stepped closer, her tone colder. "You heard me. I said you can get it yourself. I'm not your servant." The cabin went completely silent. Everyone froze, no one even breathed. The engines hummed in the background, but inside the jet the tension was thick enough to feel. Derek looked at her directly. His voice stayed level, though his patience was running thin. "I never said you were. I simply asked for a glass of water. You're being disrespectful for no reason." Something in those words triggered her. Her face twisted with anger. "No reason?" she snapped. "You think you can talk to people however you want because you're some big CEO on your fancy jet? People like you think the world owes you everything." "People like me?" Derek repeated, his voice dropping lower. He was trying to keep control, but his team could see his jaw tighten. "You don't know me, Sarah. I know enough," she shouted. "I've seen the way your kind treats workers like me, like we're nothing." The words stung, not because of what she said, but because of how much hate was behind them. Derek took a deep breath, holding himself back from reacting. He looked around the cabin. His team looked terrified, confused, unsure what to do. "Sarah," he said slowly, "you need to calm down. You're crossing a line." But before anyone could stop her, Sarah took a step closer and hit him. A quick, sharp slap across his face. The sound echoed through the cabin like a gunshot. For a second, no one moved. Everyone's eyes went wide in shock. Derek didn't even react at first. He just stood there frozen, one hand slowly moving to his cheek. The air seemed to disappear. No one could believe what had just happened. James jumped to his feet. "What is wrong with you?" he shouted. "You just hit him." Sarah didn't back away. Her chest was rising and falling fast, her hands trembling. "He deserved it," she cried. "You all think you can treat me like dirt." "Enough!" Derek's voice finally rose, strong, deep, and full of control. "This stops right now." Sarah flinched but didn't move. Her eyes filled with tears, one not of guilt but of fury. "You don't tell me what to do," she yelled back. Derek took a slow step toward her but kept his voice firm. "You've just assaulted me on my own aircraft. Sit down now. When we land, you'll explain yourself to the authorities." Sarah's face turned pale. The reality of what she had done started to sink in. She took a step back, shaking her head. No, you don't understand." "Sit down," Derek said again, this time more forcefully. But instead of sitting, she turned and stormed toward the galley, slamming the curtain shut behind her. The team looked at each other in disbelief. James whispered, "We need to call ground control or someone." Derek rubbed his cheek slowly, still shocked. He didn't want to make things worse in the air. "No," he said quietly. "Let's not panic. She's unstable, but I'll handle it when we land." From behind the curtain, the sound of a phone dialing could be heard faintly. Sarah was making a call, her hands shaking, her voice low but urgent. No one in the cabin knew who she was calling. No one could imagine that the next 10 minutes would turn this strange incident into something far more explosive, something that would change everyone's life forever. Derek sat down again, silent, staring out the window. His reflection looked calm, but inside his mind 1,000 thoughts were racing. He wasn't angry anymore, he was focused. Something didn't add up, and his instincts told him that this wasn't over. He was right. The confrontation had just begun. The jet felt like it had frozen in the sky. For a full minute after Sarah slapped Derek, no one spoke. The only sound was the steady hum of the engines, a strange reminder that they were still thousands of feet above the earth. Everyone sat still, afraid to move or breathe too loudly. Derek Miles slowly exhaled, trying to process what had just happened. A flight attendant on his own private jet had hit him. Not just anyone, but Sarah Donovan, the woman who had been calm, professional, and polite when they boarded. How had she gone from courteous to furious so fast? It didn't make sense. Behind the curtain in the narrow galley, Sarah was pacing back and forth. Her mind was racing. She couldn't believe what she had done. One moment she was angry. The next she had slapped the CEO. Her heart pounded in her chest and her hands were trembling. But instead of feeling guilty, another emotion began to take over. Fear. She knew what was coming. Derek would report her. She'd lose her job. Maybe worse. She'd be branded as unstable, disrespectful, and unfit. All her years of service would mean nothing. The thought burned inside her. She grabbed the small satellite phone near the coffee machine and dialed a number with shaky fingers. In the cabin, James whispered to Derek, "Should I go check on her?" Derek shook his head. "No, let her calm down." His voice was steady, but his expression was unreadable. He wasn't angry, he was focused. Years of business leadership had taught him that the worst decisions were made in anger. He'd wait, then he'd act. From behind the curtain, faint muffled talking could be heard. Sarah's voice was low but fast. "I need you to listen," she said into the phone. "Something happened. He provoked me." "No, you don't understand. They're lying. I didn't mean to." Her breathing got heavier. The person on the other end seemed to be someone important, someone she trusted. After a moment of silence, her tone changed. "What, you'll handle it? Right now?" She paused, listening, then nodded slowly, even though no one could see her. "Okay," she whispered. "Do it." When Sarah returned to the cabin, her face looked completely different. The anger was gone, replaced by an eerie calm. She smoothed her uniform, stood tall, and walked with quiet confidence. Derek's team turned their heads, waiting to see what she'd do next. "Ms. Donovan," Derek said firmly, standing up again. "I think we need to discuss what just happened. Violence is unacceptable." Before he could finish, she interrupted. "Mr. Miles, you should sit down." Her tone was strange, not apologetic, but commanding. Derek frowned. "Excuse me." She looked at him directly. "You should sit down. It's already being handled." "What's being handled?" he asked. She didn't answer. Instead, she took out her phone and typed something quickly. The rest of the team exchanged nervous glances. James whispered, "Handled by who?" Derek sat back slowly, suspicion rising. Something wasn't right. He had the uneasy feeling that Sarah had just done something drastic. A few minutes later, the intercom light near the cockpit blinked. Sarah walked over and spoke softly to the pilots. The pilots looked confused, then nodded uncertainly. One of them even glanced back toward Derek's cabin with wide eyes. When she returned, Sarah looked strangely satisfied. "We'll be landing earlier than expected," she said. "There's been a change in plans." Derek's brows tightened. "A change? Who authorized that?" "I did," she said simply. The words hit him like a punch. "You did?" he repeated slowly, disbelief coloring his voice. "This is my jet, Sarah. You don't make decisions here." But Sarah only smiled faintly. "Actually," she said, "that's where you're wrong." The air in the cabin grew even heavier. No one understood what she meant, but everyone could sense danger in her tone. "Explain yourself," Derek said firmly. She walked closer, folding her arms. "I just spoke to your co-owner, Mr. Harlan," she said. "He knows everything." "I told him what happened. He believes you crossed the line, and he's authorized me to take immediate action." Derek's team looked stunned. "Immediate action?" James said. "What are you talking about?" Sarah took a deep breath and delivered the words that would turn the flight upside down. "You're all fired." The cabin went dead silent. Derek blinked, thinking he misheard her. "What did you just say?" Sarah's eyes didn't flinch. "You and your entire team are dismissed from the company, effective immediately." The message came straight from the top. For a moment, it felt like the world stopped spinning. Derek stood frozen, unable to believe what he was hearing. His mind raced. Harlan, his co-owner, was powerful enough to make decisions like that. But why would he do it now? Over one phone call? "Sarah," he said slowly, voice low but dangerous. "If this is a joke, it's not funny." "It's not a joke," she replied coldly. "You'll receive formal notice once we land. For now, you'll remain seated. The company doesn't want further incidents." James jumped to his feet. "You can't fire a CEO on his own plane," he shouted. "This is insane." Sarah's calm smile didn't fade. "You'd be surprised what can happen when the right person makes a single phone call." The engines hummed louder, as if echoing the chaos inside the cabin. Derek sat down slowly, his heart pounding. 10 minutes ago, he was the most powerful man on that plane. Now he was being told he had no authority at all. No one spoke after that. The silence was sharp, painful. Outside, the clouds kept drifting past, peaceful and white. The exact opposite of what was happening inside. Sarah walked back to the galley, her expression unreadable. The slap, the call, the firing, it had all happened in 10 minutes. 10 minutes that destroyed trust, power, and careers. Derek looked out the window again, his reflection staring back at him. Calm, strong, but burning inside. Something deep inside told him this wasn't the end. Whatever game Sarah and Harlan were playing, he was going to uncover it. But for now, all he could do was sit, think, and wait for the jet to land, where the real battle was waiting. For the first time in his career, Derek Miles felt powerless. The hum of the jet engines filled the silence like a reminder that he was trapped, not just in the air, but in a situation that made no sense. He sat back in his seat, eyes fixed on the window, but his reflection didn't look like the confident CEO everyone knew. It looked like a man caught off guard, betrayed and disbelieving. Just 10 minutes earlier, he was giving orders, planning million-dollar deals, leading his team with calm authority. Now, a flight attendant, the same woman who was supposed to serve him coffee, had claimed she had fired him and his entire team. The absurdity of it almost made him laugh, but the cold seriousness in Sarah's face told him it was no joke. His assistant James leaned close and whispered, "Sir, there's no way this is real. She can't have that kind of power." Derek didn't respond. He was too deep in thought, replaying every word Sarah had said. I spoke to your co-owner. He authorized me to act. The name Harlan echoed in his mind. Harlan Pierce, his business partner, co-owner of Miles and Pierce Enterprises. A man he once trusted like a brother. They had built their empire together, from nothing to everything. But lately things had been tense between them. Derek had noticed the small betrayals, the closed-door meetings, the skipped calls, the unsigned documents. Still, he never imagined Harlan would go this far. Sarah reappeared from the galley, holding a tablet in her hands. The orders have been confirmed, she said flatly. You'll receive official termination documents upon landing. James jumped up again. You're out of your mind, he shouted. You're not a manager, you're a flight attendant. Who do you think you are? Sarah didn't flinch. She looked at him with a calm, almost smug expression. I'm someone who follows orders, she said softly. And right now the order is clear. Derek's voice finally broke the silence.
Sit down, James. But sir, I said sit. James obeyed, though reluctantly.
Derek's calmness wasn't weakness, it was control. He knew anger wouldn't fix this. He needed information, not emotion. He turned to Sarah. Let's clear one thing up, he said in a low, steady voice. You said you called Harlan. That means you have his private line. How? Sarah looked at him, and for the first time her eyes softened slightly. Not with sympathy, but something else. Because I don't just work for the airline, she said. I work for him. Derek's stomach dropped. It all made sense now. Harlan had planted her there, not just as a flight attendant, but as his personal employee, someone to watch, listen, and report. So you were spying, he said slowly. She shrugged. Call it whatever you want. My job was to make sure everything stayed under control. Derek leaned forward, his tone turning sharper. Under control? You hit a CEO in his own cabin, and now you're claiming authority you don't have. You call that control? Sarah's lips twitched, a ghost of a smile. Control isn't always about calmness, Mr. Miles. Sometimes it's about knowing who's really in charge. Her words stung more than the slap had. The rest of the team sat in stunned silence. Every second that passed made the air heavier, colder. Derek could feel his heart beating faster, but his face remained unreadable. He was thinking, analyzing, planning his next move. That's what leaders did, even when the ground under them was crumbling. Sarah checked her watch. We'll be landing in 20 minutes, she said. Security will meet you at the airfield. You'll be escorted to headquarters for further discussion. James muttered under his breath. This is insane. Derek didn't look away from Sarah. Tell me something, he said quietly. When Harlan told you to do this, did he also tell you why? Sarah hesitated. Just for a second. That hesitation told him everything. She didn't know the full story. She was being used, just like he had been blindsided. You're just a messenger, Derek said, his voice turning colder now, and messengers often get caught in the crossfire. Sarah's expression flickered. For the first time, she looked unsure. I'm not your enemy, she said, her voice quieter now. I'm just doing what I was told. Then you're not thinking for yourself, he replied. And that's the most dangerous kind of person there is. The rest of the flight passed in uneasy silence. Derek didn't speak again. His mind was racing, but outwardly he was calm and too calm. He pulled out his phone, typed a message to his legal counsel, and hit send. It read, Emergency. Meet me on landing. Confidential. Sarah sat down near the front of the cabin, pretending to check her notes, but she kept glancing back at Derek. Something about his composure unsettled her. She had expected him to shout, threaten, or lose control. But he didn't. Instead, he looked like a man quietly planning his counterattack. The jet began to descend through thick white clouds. The light outside shifted from bright gold to pale gray. It felt like they were dropping into a storm. And in a way they were. As the wheels touched the runway, Derek looked out the window, watching the airport grow larger beneath them. His reflection in the glass looked calm again, but this time his eyes burned with determination. He whispered under his breath, You want a power shift, Harlan? Fine, let's play. Sarah stood up and opened the door as soon as they stopped. On the ground, 2 men in dark suits were waiting. They weren't police, they were corporate security. Derek rose slowly, buttoning his jacket, his face unreadable. His team followed behind, silent and tense. As he stepped off the plane, the air outside felt heavy, humid and full of unspoken war. For Sarah, the job seemed done. But for Derek, it had only just begun. He wasn't defeated, just delayed. And if there was one thing everyone who knew Derek Miles understood, it was this: you could shake his power, but you could never take it away. The private jet door opened with a hiss of pressurized air. The world outside looked bright, but the air inside the cabin was thick and tense. Derek Miles stood up slowly, buttoning his jacket as if preparing for a meeting instead of a confrontation. The team behind him looked pale, nervous, and silent. None of them had ever seen their calm, confident CEO in a situation like this. On the tarmac below, two men in dark suits were waiting beside a black SUV. Their faces were unreadable. No smiles, no greetings, just business. Sarah Donovan stepped forward first, clipboard in hand, walking down the stairs with the quiet confidence of someone who thought she had already won. As Derek followed, the sunlight hit his face. He blinked against it, his mind clear and focused now. He wasn't thinking about the slap anymore. He wasn't even angry. He was thinking like a strategist, one who had just discovered that his opponent had made their first big move. When his shoes touched the ground, one of the men stepped forward. "Mr. Miles," he said curtly, "I'm Richard Hale from Corporate Security. Mr. Pierce has asked us to escort you and your team to headquarters for a debrief." Derek's voice was calm. "A debrief? For what?" "For your dismissal, sir," Richard said, avoiding eye contact. James let out a short, angry laugh. "You've got to be kidding me," he said. "You can't just walk up to a CEO on the runway and fire him like some intern." Richard didn't flinch. "I'm only following instructions. You'll be briefed inside." Derek's team looked to him for direction. He raised one hand slightly in a signal to stay quiet. Then he nodded once. "Fine," he said. "Let's go." The ride to headquarters was silent except for the low hum of the SUV's engine. Sarah sat in the front seat beside the driver, her posture stiff but proud. In the back, Derek looked out the window, his mind replaying every step of the past few hours. The tension, the slap, the phone call, the so-called termination. He knew something bigger was happening. Harlan's fingerprints were all over this. This wasn't about a slap or an argument. It was about control. When they arrived at the headquarters, a tall glass building gleaming under the sun, the atmosphere was colder than usual. Employees glanced up as Derek walked through the lobby, whispering quietly. Word had spread fast. In the boardroom, the truth finally surfaced. Harlan Pierce was already there, sitting at the head of the table, looking calm and collected. He stood when Derek entered, but there was no handshake, no warmth, only polite distance. "Derek," Harlan said, his voice smooth. "I wasn't expecting to see you personally. I thought security would handle the transition." "Transition?" Derek repeated quietly. "You call this a transition? You had your employee assault me and then deliver fake termination orders mid-flight." Harlan gave a slight smirk. "Fake? Oh no, they're very real. Effective immediately, the board has voted to remove you as acting CEO. Your position is being terminated pending investigation." James slammed his hand on the table. "On what grounds?" "Misconduct," Harlan said simply. "There was a report from a staff member, Ms. Donovan, describing an inappropriate altercation. Physical intimidation, verbal aggression. We take these matters seriously." Sarah stood quietly in the corner, avoiding Derek's eyes. She looked confident on the outside, but her fingers twisted nervously behind her back. She hadn't expected the situation to escalate this far, but now she couldn't back out. Derek's voice was calm, but sharp as glass. "So that's your play," he said. "You plant someone on my flight, provoke an argument, twist the story, and use it to push me out." "Impressive, Harlan." "Dirty but impressive." Harlan smiled faintly. "It's just business, Derek. You've been too distracted lately. The company needs focus." Derek's eyes narrowed. "And by focus you mean control, and your control." Silence filled the room. The air felt electric, thick with tension. "Security," Harlan said finally. "Please escort Mr. Miles and his team out. Their clearances are revoked effective immediately." Sarah flinched slightly at his words. Even she hadn't expected it to be this ruthless. As the guards approached, Derek stood up slowly. He adjusted his suit, looked straight at Harlan and said, "You just made the biggest mistake of your career." Harlan's smirk faded for a moment. Derek's voice carried quiet strength. the kind that made even enemies hesitate. As Derek and his team walked out, the building seemed unusually quiet. Employees turned their heads, whispering. No one spoke to him, but everyone's eyes followed him until the elevator doors closed. Outside, the air was hot and heavy. James kicked the side of the SUV in frustration. They can't do this. They can't. Derek placed a steady hand on his shoulder. They already did, he said softly. But it's not over. Sarah stood a few feet away, still holding her clipboard. Her confident look had faded. She expected Derek to yell, to curse her, to break down. But he didn't. Instead, he looked at her with quiet disappointment. You think you won, he said softly. But you were just used. The people who pull strings never get their own hands dirty. Remember that? Sarah swallowed hard, unable to answer. As Derek's car drove away from the building, she stood on the steps, feeling the weight of what had happened. The power she thought she had suddenly felt meaningless. Harlan hadn't praised her or even looked at her twice. She was just a pawn in a much larger game. Inside the car, Derek stared out at the skyline, his reflection calm but determined. They think they ended me, he said quietly. But they just woke me up. And deep inside, he was already planning his next move. A move that would turn the game around in ways none of them saw coming. The city skyline looked different that evening. The tall glass towers, the busy streets, the flashing billboards. Everything that once made Derek Miles feel powerful now looked distant, cold, and unfamiliar. He sat alone in the back of a quiet cafe, the same one where he used to plan big deals and celebrate victories. But this time there were no smiles, no champagne, no team. Just him, his thoughts, and the echo of betrayal. It had been only 12 hours since the confrontation, but it felt like days. News of his termination had already spread online. Articles popped up everywhere. CEO removed amid in-flight incident. Private jet altercation leads to corporate shakeup. The headlines made him sound like a villain, a man who'd lost control. Derek scrolled through his phone, reading comment after comment. Some people defended him, others mocked him. The truth didn't matter to the internet. Only the story did. He sighed and put the phone down, staring at his untouched coffee. He thought about Sarah. He could still see the look on her face. Half fear, half defiance. Somewhere deep down, he knew she hadn't planned all of it. She was being used. But that didn't change what had happened. She had hit him, humiliated him, and given his enemies exactly what they needed. Then he thought about Harlan Pierce, his former friend, now his rival. They had built Miles and Pierce Enterprises together, starting from a cramped office and a single idea. They'd faced investors, rejections, and failures side by side. But somewhere along the line, greed and ego had poisoned their partnership. Harlan wanted control, and Derek's success had become a threat. Control, Derek muttered under his breath. That's all this was about. He opened his laptop and began typing. Not for the company, not for press, and for himself. A personal letter, maybe a statement. But the words didn't come easily. How do you explain a betrayal that deep? How do you describe being thrown out of your own empire in front of the world? Before he could think further, his phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. He hesitated, then opened it. Meet me at the old hangar tonight. I have something you need to see, no name, no details. But something about it felt serious. Derek's instincts, the same ones that built his empire, told him to go. 2 hours later, he stood at the edge of a dimly lit airfield, the night wind brushing against his suit. The old hangar loomed ahead, empty, silent, forgotten. Inside, a single light flickered. From the shadows, a figure stepped forward. It was Lisa Grant, one of his former executives. Someone he trusted once, someone Harlan had forced out months ago. Lisa, he said, surprised. She nodded, holding up a folder. I heard what happened, and you need to see this. She handed him the folder. Inside were documents, emails, financial transfers, contracts. His eyes widened as he scanned them. These are internal records, he said. Harlan's been moving company funds into a private shell, offshore. Lisa nodded. For months. He's been planning this. He needed you out of the way before anyone noticed. Derek closed the folder slowly. Everything clicked. The betrayal, the flight, Sarah's involvement. It wasn't about the slap at all. It was about money, control, and power. Harlan had used Sarah as the trigger to remove him before the board could see what was really happening. Lisa looked around nervously. You didn't hear this from me, she said. He's watching everyone, even me. But you can still fight back, Derek. You built this company. People will listen to you. Derek looked up, the flickering light reflecting in his eyes. For the first time that day, there was a spark, not of anger, but purpose. I'm not fighting for the company anymore, he said quietly. I'm fighting for the truth. He shook Lisa's hand firmly. Thank you. Be careful. Don't contact me again unless it's secure. She nodded and left quickly, disappearing into the darkness. Derek stood there for a long moment, feeling the weight of everything settle on his shoulders. The night air was cool, but his mind was burning with plans. He knew what he had to do: gather proof, contact allies, expose Harlan's corruption. But most importantly, he had to stay calm and smart. That was his strength. As he walked back to his car, his phone buzzed again. This time it was another message, from an unknown number, but he knew immediately who it was. You shouldn't have gone to the hangar. Derek froze. The words glowed on his screen, cold and threatening. His heart pounded, but he smiled faintly. Whoever sent it, whether Harlan or someone else, and had just confirmed one thing. They were afraid. He slipped his phone into his pocket and whispered to himself, "Good, they should be." Driving away from the airfield, the city lights shimmered in the distance. Every skyscraper, every window reminded him of the empire he had built, and the one he would reclaim. Harlan thought he had buried him. Sarah thought she had ended him. But the truth was, Derek Miles had just begun to rise again. And this time he wasn't flying for business. He was flying for revenge, redemption, and justice.